Hi, folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about an interesting and I think very noteworthy, but hardly spoken about development since mass migration began and the effects of it, sort of the real practical effects on the ground in once homogenous white Western countries. And that is that in places like Australia, Canada, the United States, and Britain, more than 1/4 of the electoral districts into the federal or even to the various state parliaments, more than 1/4, and even just over 1/3 in some areas, will only elect or will only elect a non-white or a black-brown candidate. So non-white candidates are just unelectable in those. They won't even get a tiny proportion of the vote. So this, of course, is something that I'm sure the globalists wanted to have happen. It further degrades, it further undermines, it further delegitimizes, if you like, the entire democratic process, which is what they want. They want people to turn away from democracy, the World Economic Forum, the Black Rocks and all this sort of stuff. They want the people to turn away from the democratic process, the very concept of electing your own leaders. And so we become so disenchanted and disillusioned with democracy that we just go and hand over control, or through a death by 1,000 cuts process, we hand over control to these financial elites, and they in turn have puppets in a supposed government, but it's not really a government. In fact, no Western country at the moment has a sovereign government, not one. They're all globalist controlled. That's why they're terrified of Donald Trump, because he would, as president, a sovereign president, he would return the United States into a sovereign country, sovereign nation state, and this is why they're determined to stop him at all costs. But coming back to this business of electoral districts that will only vote for black-brown candidates. Now, because of the ghetto-like, firstly, because of the mass migration. Bear in mind that Australia's population has grown by, in 25 years, it's grown by more than, it's grown by 27, 28%. And that's pretty much all, well, it is, it's all from mass migration. And all the people with a very small number of exceptions, all the people that are being brought in are black, brown peasants from the third world who are illiterate in their own language. This idea we're sold there's a shortage of skills and we have to bring in doctors and engineers and rocket scientists and so on, and all these illiterate peasants are really rocket scientists. I mean, that's nonsense, absolute nonsense. And both right and left wing, centre right, centre left governments and politicians and think tanks have all been telling us these lies. So there's been a mass importation of illiterate peasants who've never participated in democracy. They've got no comprehension of what it is. They've got no concept of what it is. And I was talking to somebody from China who migrated here a few years ago, and she was of the view that you could compel people to vote how you wanted them to. And I was trying to explain to her about her English is good enough to understand this, but I was trying to explain to her, well, people choose their government in a democracy that is supposed to exist. At least in democracy, you choose your representatives, and those representatives then represent you or your district or your area, your town, your city, whatever, in a federal or a state or regional parliament. And then they debate the issues and formulate legislation. And she just couldn't get her head around that. You mean the people choose? I mean, you got to be kidding. No way. And she said, well, there are certain people you wouldn't want to have a choice. Well, I get, I do understand that, but that's what democracy is, that the people choose their government. And it's the burden of responsibility is on the politicians to adequately and honestly explain their policies and the policies they're putting forward to make the lives better of the people that they represent. And that's the whole concept of it. Now, I did concede that seems to be unwinding at the moment, and there are many forces at work that are deliberately trying to undermine and unwind the democratic process. But nonetheless, she had no concept of that and couldn't. To her way of thinking, the elites should and must, and it's incumbent on them to make those decisions, and it's nothing to do with the people. And this idea that they have choice is simply ludicrous, and it's a recipe for disaster and disharmony and so on. Now, because there's a homogenous society, then it works actually quite well. The less homogenous, the more difficult democracy becomes. And wherever democracy has been attempted, where there is no homogeneity in terms of the racial social structure of the people, then it tends not to work. You had situations, say in Europe or in Britain as a case in point, where the peasant class would agree to give power to the aristocratic class, but only on the basis that the aristocrats delivered an outcome that the people approved of. So you had a different sort of concordat there that really goes back to the time of the Magna Carta in 1200s in Britain, which created a power sharing arrangement. So really, it's democracy is about power sharing. This is something that people from overseas who never come from, people from the third world countries, it'll be China or India, they don't really understand that. If you have democracy, it's pretend democracy and you subvert it, and it's only there to distract the masses. Or you have an authoritarian state, and the idea of sharing power is simply ludicrous. And why, if you have power, would you agree to share it? And they don't understand continuity and building and creating wealth. Why would people go to the way to create wealth, new wealth, invent new equipment, invent the spinning jenny, or why would the people go to their way to do that if A, the government was going to take everything from them, or if they didn't have some say in the administrative procedures that may surround things like registering a business and so on. So there's these people coming in have no concept of you vote tribally or you vote culturally, but the idea that you vote for policies and so on is simply, it's beyond the pale. They just cannot conceive of that. And the idea that you would make decisions in the common good is equally inexplicable. If you have power, you make sure your tribe, your family, your culture benefits, and screw the others. Or systemic democracy, this voting, choosing in policies, it's all bullshit. So they don't see it that way. And when you import a class of that many people, I mean, we're talking millions upon millions, when you import that many people who have no concept of, do not agree with, cannot understand the procedures, and the benefits of democracy in terms of continuity and stability and transition of power without taking 1,000 people out the back and murdering them, all this sort of stuff. They've got no concept of that. Raw power is what you exercise, and this idea of sharing wealth for the common good is something, again, they don't comprehend. And something I've mentioned many times is that these third world people don't understand creating wealth. They cannot conceive of it. I'm sure there are some exceptions, but they cannot conceive of it. There's a fixed pot of money in the world, and if you want more, you've got to take what the other guy's got. And if you can do that through trickery, deception, and treachery, and underhanded, cunning methods, then that just means you're a bit smarter than they are, and you deserve the extra, and they deserve to lose it because they weren't cunning enough or deceitful enough, and so therefore you take. So all those things mix in. So when you get a ghetto of Indians, Chinese, it doesn't matter. Ethiopians, Eritreans, who cares? That when you get a ghetto of those, and they form ghettos, they will only vote for a member of their tribe. Now, cynically, the Western political machines, particularly as they were brought under the control of the globalists, which they all are now, they cynically thought to exploit that. So instead of forcing them to vote for a white candidate that has policies, worthwhile policies, they were straight away corrupted and said, okay, now you want an Eritrean to that far, you want an Indian, you want this, you want the Sikh, we'll give it to you. We'll pick one of your corrupt crony, buddy, flunky mates, in your tribe, and that will give them a gift, an affirmative action gifted seat in Parliament. all the trappings of white man's wealth and so on, and then they can dispense goodies and handouts and bits and pieces to the key tribal leaders in your region or district, and then the corruption will be complete. And so that's what's ended up happening. So this merely confirms the view of these ghetto people, these recent arrivals in the West. Well, democracy's bullshit anyway. Look at this, where they're handing out gifts to us. It could be cozy jobs in the public service, could be building contracts or service contracts, cleaning for government buildings. There's no competitive bidding. They get the insider trading benefit and all government deals being done. And taxpayer money is simply sprayed around on the basis of patronage and cronyism and of course, other various forms of corruption. So it's added immensely to the corrupt new state that we're seeing in the West, and cheered on by the BlackRocks and all those guys. This is what they want, and they want it, and they're getting it too. So, but we've got a state now where I'd say over the next 25 plus years, white people in Parliament and in these jobs will be in the absolute minority. Now, it may not matter at that point because the globalists will have achieved total control anyway and total subjugation of the political process all across the Western world. So who can Mickey Mouse, Yogi Bear? It doesn't matter who sits in Parliament. It's all irrelevant. All the big decisions, important decisions, worthwhile decisions will be made by the BlackRocks and so on. And the only decisions that will be left for the supposed local parliamentary democracies will be to decide how many black lesbian painting classes there are around the country, and there'll be much outrage. And studies show there's not enough black lesbian painting classes in Australia. We're going to solve that problem and stop those evil fascist Nazi races. It's going to go on those lines. So this is where it's at. But it's quite a stunning sort of development and a true representation of the degradation of our society, Western societies, that now white people are unelectable. This is in Iran, this is in a white country, unelectable in between 1/4 and 1/3 of the electoral districts in the country. And again, this is all across the Western world. And the idea is that you get controllable flunkies out of the black populations in those areas. And you can see it in Britain, where the black politicians who've been gifted affirmative action, gifted their seats in Parliament, they couldn't have earned that at any sort of merit, and yet they're running around demanding compensation for their descendants in the Caribbean from their descendants in the Caribbean from what were once alleged slave colonies and sorts of things. So they've now become representatives in the Parliament of Britain for the place where their great grandparents came from, and that's insane. So there's a few things that are, and this is again indicative of the degradation of the West. That if you're going to put people into the federal parliament, they must be committed. So you would think they must be committed citizens, patriotic, dutiful citizens, bound, and they've taken an oath to represent, the rule of law and the common good and all this sort of stuff. And they could so blithely disregard that and just say there's just too many white people in this white country. Well, what if the reverse? What if 1/4 of the Chinese government was white, or 1/4 of the Japanese government was white, or Korean government, or whatever? As in just recent migrants having arrived here. It would be unthinkable. It would be colonialism all over again and evil fascist Nazis. It just wouldn't stop. But yet this is considered not only acceptable but even desirable, and that we should have more of it. And again, white people will be within the next 30 years will be an absolute minority of political representatives in Western governments. Again, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that may not matter because the globalists will be in total control, even more control than they have now, and they've got a lot of every big decision that we see, the mass migration, the climate change, all the big decisions are being made by the globalists, and increasingly all the Western, the remaining Western governments are left to do is to decide on the big issues like workplace sexual harassment laws or something like those are the big issues that they have to deal with, while the whole place is falling apart. But of course, they're protected, these people. And when you're sitting down talking to people who are absolutely immune from the effects of all this, their income is so vast and their wealth is so vast that they are utterly immune from all the effects of this. Now, the effects will catch up with them over time, and their children will suffer the effects of this, and it won't be pleasant. But today, as they sit in their waterfront homes and get onto their yachts and cruise around the harbour and drive their $200,000 motor vehicles around, these sorts of things, they don't give a fuck about what's happening, and it seems far away, and something they don't need to care about at all. It was interesting, sort of looking at just hours before, or days before the Japanese invasion of Singapore, for example. Japanese troops were landing all over the place, and it was clearly things were not so good, and yet the elites in Singapore, who are mainly British, the elites in Singapore were still having their they're having their dancing nights, and they were still feasting and banquets in the clubs, and still having parties and this sort of thing. And only in a few days' time, they were all going to be invaded by the Japanese Imperial Army, and yet they were just going on partying, oblivious, as if the problem even didn't exist and was far away. It seems quite astonishing, but that seems to be, I think anyway, what's happening in the West today. You've been with Tacitus State, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.